Do is I'm going to mute everyone just so your background noises and stuff don't get in the way. You can always unmute yourself. The way we're going to do this tonight is we're going to do about a 15-minute interview session. Dr. Ben Riggs, our music director, has agreed to be our person who's going to interview the Reverend John Dwyer. And then from there, we'll go into discussion and questions that you may have. But it is my pleasure to welcome our associate, the Reverend John Dwyer, tonight to talk about his book, Those Seven References, a book that is often that explains what does the Bible actually say about homosexuality, those passages that are often used to abuse the LGBT community and hurt people. And so let's just go with it and see what we come up with. And with that, I turn it over to Ben and John.
Hi, everybody. We're so glad to be here tonight. And so as John said, we're just going to open tonight with a little short introduction to the book via sort of interview style. I'm going to ask John a couple questions just to kind of get the ball rolling. And then this is, I think it's going to be, we're open, I think, to anything we want to talk about. It can be questions for John afterwards or comments about what we've been talking about or about the book, or just impressions, that you had while reading the book or wanted to just discuss amongst ourselves. So for those of you who don't know, most of you know me. I'm the music director at St. John's, and our author tonight of those seven references, the Reverend John Dwyer, is an Episcopal priest who he is currently the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President at Church Divinity School of the Pacific, CDSP in Berkeley, and he is also my husband. So that's why we're like zooming to you from two different rooms in the same apartment. We moved to the Bay Area almost 4 years ago when John got an offer for this position at CDSP. And then it was, soon after that St. John's had an opening, and I was grateful to join the staff, professional staff at St. John's, and with my husband, John, as an associate, a clergy person. So let's all just on our mute give a nice mimed applause to welcome our author.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to see all of you.
So, John, I just thought to get sort of things going tonight, could you, maybe let everybody know when did you first have an idea about wanting to write a book like this, or look into these biblical references that have been used so often to, as John Owen said, to abuse the LGBT community? And if you don't mind elaborating on it, what was the process like researching and writing this?
It began in seminary, and I actually wrote this in my my third year. I wrote the original version in my third year in seminary as a thesis project, and then I expanded it 2 years later. But the genesis of it came from my seminarian experience at St. Thomas's Parish in DuPont Circle. St. Thomas's Parish is a parish that still is predominantly gay and lesbian, and it's where I served as seminarian. They have a storied past. They used to have a Gothic structure that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was senior warden of when he was Secretary of the Navy, and he and Eleanor attended there when they were president. When he was president, I almost said they were president, they in 1969 there was an arson, and the church burned down, and the parish survived by worshiping in their parish hall for the next 40 years. They've just finished building a new church. That process began when I was in seminary there in the in the 2000s, the early 2000s, and it took them close to 20 years, a further 20 years of work to get that building built. While I was seminarian there, early on, this was a remarkable parish because it was 80% of the congregation was gay or lesbian and were under 35 years old. And many of them, they were young, new to DC, looking for a church home, had been raised in various denominations. Many of them abused terribly. A number of them kicked out of their homes, their family portraits taken off the wall. And they'd come to visit, or as seminarian, I'd be talking with them. And they really struggled with these verses being thrown at them as kids and being and not knowing how to respond. And so that spurred on my talking to the rector, my talking to advisors at school, and they said that sounds like a really great senior project, a senior thesis project. And so it was a 2-semester research process that I got credit for to do. And what was the process? It was a lot of time in the library, reading a lot of different books, making lots of different copies and notes, and then discussing with my advisor how to piece it together. And after I graduated, I did more research and more writing and expanded it some, and then self-published. A year and a half after seminary, maybe it was 2 years after seminary, and it sold. It sold constantly. One of my favorite early reviews on Amazon was, "Gee, I thought this would be more exciting. It's kind of boring." To me, that's an enormous compliment, in that I was taking something that has some salacious material in it, but being academic, I guess, for lack of a better word, trying to give people language and understanding about how these passages don't really say what people say that they do say, and give an understanding of how to interpret the Bible, about how to interpret these passages, and the seriousness with which we really should do this, because it's so easy to jury pick things and take them out of context.
And you even said it's really easy to just dismiss Leviticus.
It is.
Maybe we shouldn't.
Well, it's part of the past. It's part of the story of the development of the Bible, of how these books were developed. And so I think that's why it's important not to dismiss it, because it tells about the culture that existed when these oral traditions were put down into writing, and trying to cement a culture that was a minority where they were existing and trying to exist, and were horribly persecuted. So it helps put the things around it in context, into my mind.
So, John, did you know when you started this process, did you know there were 7 references that were frequently quoted, or did that come out of your research?
That came out of my research, came out of readings that I did early on to try to really try to figure out. Well, I've heard, I think I probably heard all of these, but I'm not sure. And kind of digging into it surprised me to some extent. The Judges story, as an example, I'd never heard the Judges story before I really did the research, and found it, helpful to put that story in context to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, leading up to the Leviticus passages. So no, I didn't know there were 7, and I chose the title on purpose. The revision happened while we're talking about writing. I called Church Publishing and said, I have this book that I want to do an edit of. Would you be interested in signing a contract with me to publish this from a publishing house? And they said, well, do the revision and then we'll see. And the idea of the revision was, as I reread it, it was written from a very male perspective. And I wanted to broaden it from just a male perspective to include the wider scope of what the queer community has really grown to acknowledge in the last 12 years since the book was first published, and to try to make these passages that are used against all gay, lesbian, transgender people. It's so it was a way of taking out homosexual or male and focusing it on the wider panoply of God's beautiful creation, and make it more accessible to them. So that was the part of the major part of the revision was that, and there was some new research that I did as well. But it's trying to make it more accessible to more people is the reason for the revision.
That's great. I was interested just in rereading this, which not from proofreading it, but reading it. You spent a lot of time talking about the importance of translation and how, I mean, in many instances you list all these various published translations that I'm familiar with, and I'm slightly horrified by the words that I'm reading and how they. You'd probably agree that there's been some cultural bias in how some things have been translated into publication over the years. But could you just talk for a few minutes about going back to those original Hebrew and Greek words and finding the translations and then putting those into context?
Well, I think it's going back to the Greek words and then comparing and then really doing the parsing of the Greek words into tenses, because that's and same with the Hebrew, because that's really important in understanding what those words meant to the folks at the time that these were written down, because again, setting it in the culture that it was written for is very important, because those initial accounts, when they were put in writing, were written with a purpose in mind. And what's that purpose? And what was the culture surrounding those writings? It brings light to what the passage was meant to say and point to. And it's no surprise that most of the translations or most of the writings were done by men. Many of them misogynist, and that's not in or maybe misogynist is the wrong word, a patriarchal system. It's only recent that we haven't had a really strong patriarchal view of these writings, and so understanding that as well. As far as if you're looking at a translation from the 1930s, it's going to be different from the 1860s or the 1990s or 2010. It's important to know when that translation was published and what denomination, even what's their understanding, and what's trying to be made clear by that particular translation. In other words, there really is bias by the choice of words.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly saw that looking at the different translations. So John, I was just wondering, before we turn this over to some comments and questions from everybody who's gathered, what do you hope readers will take away from this book after they've read it?
Well, it's my motive hasn't changed from seminary, which is I think of those young abused individuals who had a deep faith but couldn't articulate why why God would love them, because they had been told because of who they are, God doesn't love them. This is a way, I think, of all of us, gay or straight, to be able to give solid assurance to people who haven't had those assurances provided to them, that they are loved, not only by us, but by God, for who they are, for how they were created. That's my hope.
That's amazing, actually. So I have a few other questions, but I think I don't want to follow with that. So I'll save them for later. So let me just take an opportunity to invite those of you on the Zoom call, if you have a question for John, or if you have a comment from the book, or if there's just something you want to share about what you felt or in reading the book, just go ahead and feel free to unmute. And if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you, but I think it's sort of open to whoever would like to start it off. I think I see Sarah Blaine.
Indeed, you see Sarah Blaine, then you see her struggling with her mute button. I just, it's so hard to read our scripture because I was thinking actually a combination of two things that are related. One is the cultural context is of, say, the Old Testament, and thus, the cultural context of the early Christians, their Jewish context is so far away and so hard to understand, and so, not something that we're familiar with. At the same time, I was struck equally by how brutal power relations are not that remote from our culture. Wow. Man, both those thoughts. And that's how my dog feels about it too.
That's excellent. And I see a few other raised hands, and I think Susan Pearpoint was next.
Well, Sheepers, John, at the risk of sounding unchristian, the word misogynist works for me. It was a little difficult for me. I was pretty freaked out by the first chapter as a woman, and in fact, as a widowed woman who reared two daughters and got them over their fears of no father by saying, "Don't worry, the most ferocious animal on earth is a mother protecting her young," and then it's set out to prove it. But having said that, the first chapter, I've only read two so far, but the first chapter was downright elegant, and I appreciated it very much. And then I got into the second chapter and wandered into Judges, and I'm going, how is John going to get out of this one? So I'm just wondering if every chapter is going to start like that.
John, what do you think? I personally found the Judges also somewhat horrifying, and it's not one I knew about. It's not in the lectionary. Are you going to preach on that sometime, Scott? John, how did Judges, is every chapter quite as harrowing?
They're each difficult in their own way. I think partly because of the cultural history that existed at the time, partly because the world was so different. Women were treated terribly. They worked with no rights, were slaves, were in some cultures at that time, it meant to simply pop out babies, and that's it. It's horrifying. So yes, they are absolutely patriarchal from a male point of view, and I think there's an arc to them, though. If read the way with the lenses that I try to put on them, in particular the New Testament writings, there's a positive nature to them that's not as horrifying. I don't know if I answered your question, Susan.
You've given me hope.
Yeah, I will agree with John. When you get to the, for me, growing up, I don't know, for some reason, even the Sodom and Gomorrah story, everybody knows more about, got less play than, you know, Paul and Romans, and, you know, and I think those are horrifying for a different reason, and that they have been used and misused so terribly. But I think it gets easier to read the book because we get a little, you know, we move away from such horrible, you know, things that you never dreamed would have been written in the Bible, actually, like that Judges chapter. Now a few others have raised hand. Kathy, I saw you have a raised hand.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sarah and Susan said. You know, reading the first chapter, I went from wide-eyed, horrified, what kind of a reaction, to this sort of reading with closed eyes going, oh, historical perspective, remember historical perspective. Because I thought, how on earth is any woman staying in this religion? After reading that, it's like, bye-bye, I'm out of here. But each chapter does kind of end with a released breath. And for that, I was very thankful. But I just thought, oh my God, I had no idea it was there, first of all. Absolutely no idea it was there. Yeah, so thank you, I think.
John, do you want to say anything to that?
Thank you for the thank you. It's I think wrestling with the scripture is a good thing. I think I say in my intro and in the introduction that it's important, or maybe it's in the conclusion. I can't remember where I put this, but you know, if we think of this as the living word of God, then we need to be in conversation with it, because it's as the world has changed, as culture has changed, as we have changed. I mean, there are certain human drives that have not changed. There are certain human cadences and behaviors that have not changed, from that we were not much different, but other things are vastly different. So how do we put the current lens of our culture on these words, of the bigger picture, as opposed to just the story? What's the underlying message, and how do we carry that forward? So stick with it is what I would say, because I really believe if we are originalists, but that's not a conversation. That's not getting to know God. That's just taking someone's translation and saying, I'm going to interpret it this way, as opposed to be in conversation and wrestle with these hard things.
That's great. You know, it makes me think, I've said this at some point recently. I don't know if it was during maybe it was a Chancel Choir Zoom or a hymn sing or something. I believe it was Gloria Steinem who said that the root of homophobia lies in misogyny. And boy, is that nowhere more clear than in these Old Testament passages that John has written about, and that Kathy was, speaking about as Susan, and it's amazing. Now I see a couple other hands. Fran had unmuted a while ago. Fran, had you wanted to say something? Yeah.
John, I'd like to thank you very much for writing this book, and I hope that this is available when people go to General Convention next year, so that it has a wider readership. And how do we persuade people from other denominations who are using those other translations of the Bible that lead them to these false interpretations? And of course, there are parts of the Roman Catholic Church, who are still having women just pop out babies.
That's unfortunately true. Not just the Roman Church, but yes. I think that's the $1 million question, Fran. Is we've as in particular the United States, we've fractured and then the election showed how fractured we are, and that we're not good at talking to one another, and that's a serious cultural problem that we are that at its root will make the conversation you're talking about, where I'm talking about, difficult, because people don't want to listen. People don't want to think sometimes, and I think that's where we have to start. I think is being able to listen to someone that we vehemently disagree with, and be able to try and have a, for lack of a better word, adult conversation with them, to say, I hear you, but I disagree, and here's why. And I think not being, that's why I was so happy with the comment about what a boring book. It's that being able to, in a calm fashion, set out a different viewpoint and an explanation as to why and where those facts come, that understanding comes from. Some people will hear it, Fran. A lot won't.
And but as I read this book, I kept going, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
That's helpful. I like that.
So John, before we take our next question, I want to follow up on Fran's question, because I was reading, the little blurbs in the front of the book from various people, and Gay Clark Jennings, who's the president of the House of Deputies, gave a little blurb at the bottom, and she had visited St. John's just a couple years ago on a Sunday morning, and she said something that said, I wrote it down, the hope that this will help Episcopalians speak out when the Bible is being used to attack our LGBTQ siblings in Christ. And I think that's actually kind of what Fran was saying, that this hope that we will have, be able to speak up and say something. And so this is not a planned question, so can you give us just a couple key points? I know every one of those references is a little bit different, and the context is different, and the translations are different. But what are some key points? I feel like there are a few when I was reading it that we can always sort of have in our back pocket to talk about when we hopefully can have those discussions with people who disagree with us.
Taking that step back, basically, and looking at as opposed to the individual story, the greater message from those individual stories, putting Leviticus aside, we'll come back to that. It's about questioning power and questioning authority. And it's who's in power, who has the authority, who's being hurt, who's being treated inappropriately. And those are the people we should be reaching out to help, and focus on. And so that, in particular, if we think about the Romans passage, where I talk about, he's setting this trap for us to fall into, say, yeah, they're bad, it's them. And then he says, if you judged, you're the one who did the wrong. You're not supposed to judge these others who I've just listed. And so again, who's in charge, and how are we looking at it? I think those are very broad stroke principles, and it's really living into Jesus's ministry. Who did Jesus tend to? He was always with the poor. He was always in the street, always helping those in need, the widow, the orphan. If those, it's the people who were not in power. So these passages point to people not in power who are being abused. I think one of the phrases I use, many of these really horrific things that are done to these people in these stories, it's a wrongful taking of their pride, of their person, of their personhood, of And those are, I think, are important takeaways. That it's, think about who those folks are, and who the bad actors are. And that should be the focus. I don't know if I answered your question, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. Did you want to tackle Leviticus? You said maybe later.
It's so Leviticus. Leviticus is a rule of conduct, basically, a code of conduct for the priestly class, written at a time when the Hebrew clan had lost their land, had been kicked out, and they were, they were slaves over in Assyria, and so trying to save their culture, they create these rules were written down to say, this is how we are going to protect ourselves and continue on. Has nothing to do with reality.
But in case you didn't know what incest was, they list about 27 different ways. So, okay, I won't put you on the spot for more of that, John. I've seen okay. A couple more hands raised. I saw Anne, I saw Cheryl. I think I saw Cheryl first. Cheryl, do you want to have a question or a comment?
I'll take I have a question, and that is, I don't know anything about the references that you used in terms of giving a new or different or more clear interpretation. So I guess my question is there kind of an historical perspective? In other words, do you see that people who were writing about these passages in, say, the early part of the 20th century begin shifting at a different part of the century? Do you see it? Does it happen in the 21st century as opposed to the 20th century, or is it still that everybody is mostly saying, pay attention to context, and that nobody has really yet said, right now, other than you, right now, in this time, we need to have this perspective and have it be a really broadly espoused idea?
Yeah, how about that, John? Has scholarship around this topic changed, over time, or are you the first?
Oh, I'm not the first. I will not take credit for being the first at all. They're really in the 60s, and at the same time that female or liberation and liberation theology took root in the 70s and 80s and 90s, queer theology began to grow in nascent terms in the 60s and 70s, but really blew up in the 90s, maybe the late 80s. But so it's fairly recent. I mean, there's a lot more and probably better books than mine out there about queer theology, and I took the scriptural view. I really wanted to dig into these passages, but there's a tremendous amount of really heady and intellectual theological books out there. Yeah. And there's a course taught at CDSP by Scott McDougall. I don't know if you all know who he is. He's the associate professor of theology. I knew him at my parish in New York. We're a very small church. Before he went and got his PhD. He has a course about the body and queer theology. and he's a systematic theologian, so he digs way back into theology. And then if you ever talk to a systematic theologian, they weave things, and I get lost at times when I'm trying to hold my own with Scott. But it's a 20th century, late 20th century thing, Cheryl, and it's blooming in the 21st century too.
Well, I think that I think what I appreciated the most about your book is the fact that you just said, here they are. You know, it's not like we're just going to talk about the fact that, yes, we really need to be, you know, aware of the fact that we have all these people, this broad spectrum of people in our community, and we really need to treat them all the same. You're saying, this is what people are always going to use. These are the passages that people are always going to use to try to say you are wrong. And that I really appreciated, because they're certainly not passages that I was extremely well versed in, having heard at least several of them for sure over time. But I like the fact that I now know exactly where people go to say, you know, this is wrong, this is, you know, and that there's a way to be able to counter that. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
So I saw another raised hand a minute ago. It was Anne.
Yeah, hi. I'm back to the question of how do we share this with folks in a way that allows them to hear the message. And I think that it's important that we use value neutral language. And so, which makes space for not only the attack, which may be so, but the misinformation or the different perspective. And I think that if we only use attack and abuse type vocabulary, we're not going to represent the spectrum of people who are taking a view different than this book. I think value neutral language in a lot of contexts is helpful right now, not just with this book, but because we really, if we want to bring people on board, we have to allow that space. That's my thought. What do you think?
I would agree. So I tried to talk about that with my being able to have an adult conversation of agreeing to disagree. But it's also, I think, important for people to hear that many individuals have been hurt deeply, spiritually, by these passages, or by the use of these passages against them for who they are. So being able to state that without being accusatory, I think that's part of the value neutral language, is to be able to say challenging things in as inoffensive a manner as possible. That's what I think.
So, you know, I'm more of a act up kind of guy. And one thing that I was interested in just rereading the book was, you know, me growing up, and there's maybe other people on the call who have heard this in the past, essentially, you know, in the Southern Baptist Church in, you know, Southern West Virginia, of course, that doesn't matter where or what, it's all over. The thing that I was really led to believe was, if you are gay, you're going to hell. Nothing else mattered, right? That was the thing. And that is what leads to some of this, you know, familial, you know, discord. And as even John said, you know, he knew people who had been kicked out of their houses, you know, and reading the book, I'm just like, wait a minute, you know, these references say a lot of things, but they never really say that. And, you know, one even notorious Paul, who I've never been a fan of, like, as John said, was like using his little rhetorical device to say, you know, all these things that he considers, you know, not great, including gossiping and slander, and, you know, to turn around and go, oh, are you judging those things? You shouldn't. You're the ones who are really, you're the ones who are really behaving badly by judging everybody. So I think I also appreciate, you know, the having sort of a vocabulary to engage with people on this. It's certainly a thing I didn't have growing up, and boy, I sure could have used it actually. So this is my perspective. Let's see. Now, is there anybody else who has a comment or a question or anything that we've even talked about? So wait,
Susan,
oh yeah, Susan.
Susan does.
Go ahead.
I have a question about the historical context of reading the Bible is not something I know that well. And the way it came through in Leviticus and in Judges was of a nation, if I'm interpreting what you said right, a nation that was beginning to come apart at the seams and not fulfilling its mission, or I guess you could say, and the way that the elders or the people in power tried to do their best to cure that, and the way they did it was very authoritarian, with a list of rules. And I just wondered, does that teach us that, maybe this is what you've been saying all along, that the people in power are not necessarily the ones who actually ought to be doing that when it comes to, I saw echoes in our lives today there.
Well, I think they are there. I agree with you. So the book of Judges is a series of accounts that about the devolving nature of the kingdom of Israel and how they fell apart. Basically, they dissolved and were sent into, you know, ended up in exile. And it's so those stories, many of which, some like the Judges story, mirrors the Sodom and Gomorrah story, but it's worse. These oral traditions that got written down when they went into exile is an attempt at an explanation as to what happened to us. How did this happen to us? So yes, that there's that historical nature of these accounts that explain to the remnant of the people of Israel who are in exile, how did we get here? And what do we do when we get out? We don't want to be like that, do we? We want to be like something else.
Well, did it work? So did they make Israel great again?
Well, until the Romans took them over at the beginning, when they came back into power. And then the Romans came in, and then they you know, history scattered them.
Oh. So it didn't have a good long-term effect, sounds like.
I don't know who's, yeah. It's not an accurate history of the Hebrew people, but it's in what's in the Bible is not an accurate history, but to place it when it was written, what was going on around, is helpful to understand the intent of the authors, the intent of what they were trying to do.
I just think that was a great question. And John, you I think around the Judges story, you mentioned the possibility that this was really just a political statement against King Saul, I think. And it made me wonder, especially with the similarities to the Genesis story, like, is this just another another tall tale, an allegory, a political, that just got included?
That is a possibility. Absolutely, can't say for sure, but it's whether it's a slap at King Saul or not, but it's absolutely trying to explain their predicament and how they got there.
Yeah. Hey, so I think I saw Kathy raise her hand.
Yeah, on a lighter note, there is a book called A Year of Living Biblically. If you haven't read it, it's really worth it. It's very funny, and it goes through Leviticus, and this guy pledges to live all those rules, and his wife nearly kills him. So just a little levity.
Good to have levity.
I think I saw somebody else. Father Scott has his hand raised.
Who?
Father Scott, do you have a question for Father John?
Is it my time to duck?
How do you know I wasn't just praising my hands? I like to use the word. I guess when I'm thinking about people that hold different perspectives and so forth, I've tended to use this phrase, biblical ventriloquism. When people start to say, it's like they have a puppet, the Bible puppet, and the Bible says this, and the Bible says that. And it's like, the Bible's actually not talking. Your voice transmitted into the Bible and making it sound the way you want it to sound. And I sometimes wonder if one way around that biblical ventriloquism is to ask people, what is the most challenging thing the Bible is saying to you? In other words, bring them back into their story about what is it that's challenging you right now spiritually, because sometimes I and I'm the worst at this because I like to argue, I was really intrigued recently in our Sacred Ground lesson that Howard Thurman really distinguishes between Paul and Jesus, that Paul was really a member of the empire and Jesus was not. And so he recounts a story where a Black woman refused to ever read the Apostle Paul because that was used to justify slavery, and he was constantly quoted to justify slavery, and so she never allowed the reading of Paul, even though she was an incredibly faithful Christian. She would not allow Paul to be read in the house, but only Jesus. And there's something about that where it's still part of the church. It's like St. John's. Are we an empire church? Right? Are we really subjugate? Have we felt the kind of lack of privilege that other people have experienced throughout their whole story? And so being able to acknowledge the bad parts of our story seems very honest to me. I think there's a certain kind of argument that says, well, why don't we just purify the Bible? Let's go back and cut out all the bad stuff. And I think I did that actually one day in a sermon. I took a Bible out and I started ripping pages out of it. That'll never do. That'll never do. But I guess owning up to the way we have behaved religiously throughout history seems to be a very important part of moving forward. And I'm always struck by how we can do that. I hear of, what was the town recently that apologized? What was that? The only town that has ever publicly
Yeah,
Antioch.
yeah.
Antioch, right? That's not saying, well, we weren't like that. That's like saying our story had that in it, and we need to actively repent, apologize for our actions. And I'm just going to close with a very positive thing. I think one of the proudest moments I've had as an Episcopalian is when the National Cathedral made a place for Matthew Shepard to put his ashes in, after when his family could not do that anywhere without his grave being desecrated. And the National Church said, come bring his ashes here. I find that a very positive way to respond to the pain and the suffering of other people, and especially being part of a religious tradition that has historically been abusive.
That's amazing. Thank you, Scott, for sharing that. And I see a couple other. Cheryl, you got your hand up?
Yes. I was just kind of picking up on the in the chat that Kathy Arajo had responded to Ann Lester by saying, what actually is value neutral language. And I would like to also hear a little bit about that, just because that would be helpful for me to put into this context.
Great. Ann, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess just, I'm speaking as a person who hasn't ever been harassed about my sexuality, I have to say, so I don't know a lot about that experience, but I know that when a word like, when the possibility of just misinformation is not a part of, one of the choices, it's only you have attacked these people, it may not, then one gets defensive and is unable to hear because one is busy defending. And so if we can lower the barrier by not leading with that assumption that of willful attack, it would be, I think, more useful. What do y'all think about that? I mean, I could be out in left field.
I think you make all the sense in the world, and it probably would be a good exercise for us to take some time to role play it, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like I know that part of my life I just didn't even want to come out as the C word, because people might think I'm against capital gain taxes and for homophobia, and so I could probably use some practice, Ann.
Okay, I have a question, Sarah. What is the C word?
Oh, Christian.
Christian, I think.
Oh.
I thought you were secretly conservative or something.
I think you knew better than that.
Be very careful. Be very, very careful.
Well, I think I said on Sunday something, and when I was doing the announcement that we just to what Sarah said about being maybe embarrassed to say that you identify as Christian. We live in such a little bubble, here in the Bay Area, and Bay Area Episcopalians and St. John's in the Montclair neighborhood of Oakland. It's like, that's like a bubble within a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. And we're not necessarily also the people who have propagated any of this abuse that of Christianity toward LGBT people. But it's important to know that it has been done, and and is continuing to be done, and not just by Christian people, maybe politicians claiming to be so. It's a scary thing to have to deal with, and to be able to have conversations where it's not just the Bible says it's this, I don't believe you because of whatever. To be able to talk about all of this, I think is really having the tools to be able to have the discussion is really great. Hey, Julie, you're still off mute. Did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say that I've never been a Christian. I've always been an Episcopalian.
Very good.
Okay.
Susan, you have a question? Susan Merrill?
I have a comment more.
Yeah.
Following up on what Anne said. And how does one engage with people who are identified with a negative perspective about homosexuality for, in writings in the Bible? A number of people at St. John's many years ago, I think Margie Bowman was one of them, maybe Sherry Black, it might have been back in those days. We're studying a form of what was called nonviolent communication. Marshall Rosenberg, Linda, were you part of that? But that's one model, and there are others where there's practices as how do you listen and engage without defensiveness and judgment, and just open the conversation. Of course, we had some of that right after Trump got in. There were some members of our congregation who were conservatives who actually voted for Trump in our church. And they were very offended by what was a dominant theme in our church of despair and shock that Trump was elected. And so there were a number of meetings. I attended one or two of them with this very small group. And I'm continuing to, in my own way, try to be cordial and engage. And I haven't gotten into any political discussions per se, but I think having a relationship is probably the most fundamental thing in a spiritual tradition, that we come into sacred relationship. And in fact, the emphasis that in John's book is not on judgment. So finding a way just to say, let me see if I could really understand your perspective and how and where it comes from. And if they're interested, and often people are not interested in your perspective, they can ask, and that you're available. So check out the website. It's really pretty powerful. Marshall Rosenberg, he started out as primarily working individually. He's a psychologist. And then he moved into working with differences in corporate places. And he also now works on levels between nations. I suspect there's also a pretty terrific literature and diplomacy. One of the groups of folks I have a great deal of admiration for, when you're trying to have a negotiation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, wow, that takes an incredible amount of skill and patience and hopefulness. So maybe some of you know something about that. I'd love to see how diplomats are trained, because I think it can be a model for all of us. Enough said.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Thanks for sharing that. Are there any others? I have a question for John before we're done. John, can you talk a little bit about what it was like for being an openly gay man in the clergy, say when you were first ordained, which was not, decades and decades ago. But well, maybe tell us kind of when it was and what it was like, and has it changed as your experience changed in working with congregations, or how you're viewed by the community?
I've been a priest 15 years. Sorry, Scott, I don't have as many years of cred as you do. I was raised up to go to seminary from a very supportive parish in Manhattan called St. Luke in the Fields. Seminary at Virginia Theological Seminary I was there just after Gene Robinson was ordained a bishop, and the seminary is a very southern seminary, and there was deep divide between the students of those in favor of Bishop Robinson and those not. And that was a challenge, because in the seminary chapel, students would during the prayers of the people pray for those suffering from the sin of homosexuality, with us sitting in the pews right next to them.
Wow.
So that's only 15 years ago, and that was part of my experience. I was fortunate to end up at a parish that was very supportive, and where they hired me as the associate in my second year as a seminarian. So then I spent 3 years as an associate. Getting a job after that was a challenge, honestly. I searched for it was a solid 3-year contract. Ended, and I started looking a year ahead of time and was not all that successful in finding a job. And I was unemployed for 6 months. I'm blessed to have a really good brother who helped me pay my mortgage in that time period. Bishop Chain in Washington, D.C. called me 6 months into unemployment and said, "Hey, I have this parish as far north in the diocese into Maryland as you can go, but they need a priest in charge. It's a temporary gig while they do a search. And it's not interim. I need you as priest in charge because they're not ready to do a search. This was a church that took on too much debt building a new church or parish, and they had a $4 million mortgage, and they could barely make those payments, let alone do much of anything else." I said, "Sure, I'll be happy to." He said, let me know if you have any issues." And so up I go. And seriously, this was the only dry town left in Maryland. It was about 50 minutes north of downtown DC, where my condo was. They had a rectory that I moved into, and within the first week, I received my first hate mail. I'd never received hate mail before. Pretty vile, pretty inappropriate, about gays shouldn't be ordained, you're ruining the church. And then almost weekly, maybe 10 days apart, the letters just got worse and worse and became threatening. And brought the bishop in, brought the canon to the ordinary in, brought the FBI in. And then the bishop said, "Keep looking for a job. This isn't the place for you. If you want to leave, you can leave, or you can stay." I stayed, and found the church where I became rector in Minnesota that I served 7 years. So the next job search was really the one that brought me to Berkeley, and CDSP was not that experience in Maryland. While I was looking for the search, or while I was in the search process to leave in Minnesota, there was a church in Florida that I interviewed for, and it was in the southwest area of Florida, down around Naples, not in Naples, but around Naples, and had an interview. one of my stock questions in an interview is, as an openly gay man, would that be, an openly gay married man at that point, would that be an issue for anyone in the parish? And the chair of the search committee said, well, thank you for asking that. Yes, it will be a problem for a lot of people in this parish. I wanted to say, well, what the hell are you interviewing me for? But I didn't. I just said, well, can we talk about that? And they said, well, we just don't, this just isn't part of what we believe is right. And I said, well, I guess that answers my question as to whether I'm moving forward in the process, doesn't it? I was that bold. And we ended in prayer, and so it's out there. It's still prevalent in our church, in our Episcopal church, in various areas of the country, including California.
Yeah, John, thank you for sharing that. I mean, it makes me think, all of our seminarians of various age who are going to be encountering challenges like this when they leave CDSP. It's I don't know, it's very eye-opening. And sometimes we think I actually had someone say to me in Minnesota, he was my sound engineer actually, who worked with Twin Cities Gay Men's Chorus. Right after nationally we got married, he said to me completely, fully, just like without thinking, oh, so you guys have marriage now, so will the chorus keep singing? And I just thought, oh, does that mean it's over? Or is there still work to do from an activist standpoint? And so it's a wonderful, wonderful person, and we talked about it. And why I thought there was probably still a place for the gay choral movement around the world, because there's still so much of this out there. So thank you, John. Before we stop, I think I saw in the chat Sarah had a comment. Sarah E.
I do. John, I wanted to thank you for your book. I am just so pained by the fact that for centuries, and more recently especially, you have experienced this. To me, it is just so contrary to the Presbyterian God is love, and the New Testament counts for more than the Old Testament, and Jesus counts more than any of it that I was raised with. And also having come to the bubble that is St. John's, where we think about things and we try to live those things that we learn. It's just a good reminder, your book, that we do have a lot of work to do. And I know that all of us here certainly feel like we're with you in this teaching. And so thanks so much. And Ben too, for your right-on comments as well, and to all of you actually, for your input and the feeling that we who are not gay are not alone, and also to have you know that you are not alone.
Thank you, Sarah. That's so great.
Thank you, Sarah.
Well, I just want to say, I want to thank John so much. And for me, it's a personal walk as well as another fellow gay clergy member. And I shared some of those same stories. And I think there's a lot of value to keep on learning about this situation, and how the Bible does enlighten and inform our theology, and how we value people, how we decide we're going to talk to people, what we think about the way they live and construe, and how do we celebrate it as opposed to judge it. I think a God of love is always about how do we celebrate people as a whole. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Just so you know, our next steps as far as adult education We will be starting with Confirm Not Conform this Saturday in person at St. John's at 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. if you're interested. The topic this week will be religion and spirituality, and talking about what spiritual practices are. If you've never done Confirm Not Conform, just it's a very interactive class. It's kind of a workshop style class. So I want to encourage you to consider being a part of that. Other than that, again, I want to thank you. Do you have any closing remarks, John?
I want to thank all of you for being here. It's been it's a joy to see all of you. One, it's been a while, and two, thanks for being so supportive. It's just wonderful. Thank you for this opportunity.
And I'd like to give a shout out that John will be coming to the St. John's pulpit again this summer, and I'm so grateful for you, John, for supporting St. John's and for being associate clergy here. We really value your voice and your story.
Thank you, Scott. I love being a part of St. John's.
And thanks for the book. It's fabulous. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thanks. You too.